Some souls leave the world before they ever learn how to speak. No confession, no defense, no choice made in the light of understanding. Only a heartbeat, a few months, a single day, and then silence. For many people, that silence becomes one of the hardest questions faith can face. Not because we doubt the value of the child, but because we do not know what heaven does with a soul that never had time to answer for itself. A soul that never formed words, never understood good and evil, never chose rebellion. And yet death came. This is where one ancient apocalypse gives us an image too specific to ignore. The Apocalypse of Peter does not picture these children as abandoned shadows. It does not first place them before accusation. It does not describe them as forgotten fragments of life, lost somewhere in darkness. It says they are delivered to the care of an angel. That is the first concrete image of this video. Not a courtroom, not a punishment, not a nameless silence, but an angel receiving a soul that never had a voice. So the question is not only, where do babies go after death? The deeper question is, when a soul dies before it can speak, before it can choose evil, before it can defend itself, does heaven treat that soul as guilty, silent, or entrusted? And before we can answer responsibly, we have to begin with the most painful part. What does heaven do with a soul that never had time to become guilty? Most ancient visions of afterlife judgment follow the same logic. A soul arrives. It is weighed. Its deeds are measured. It is asked to account for what it became, and if the scales tip toward guilt, consequence follows. In those texts, this is not cruelty first, it is justice. But justice requires a defendant, someone who knew enough to be responsible, someone whose rebellion can be named. A child who dies at 3 months old cannot be judged in that way. There is no rebellion to name, no corruption to expose, no moral history to weigh, only a soul too young to answer. This is where the question becomes unbearable. Not, where is the chamber of the righteous? That is a map question. The sharper question is this: how does justice work when there is no guilt? If heaven includes judgment, what happens to a soul that never entered the world of moral action? Not because it chose evil, not because it rejected good, but because it had no time to choose. Ancient apocalypses often move by consequence. You chose, therefore you answer. You rebelled, therefore you are separated. You remained faithful, therefore you are received. But a soul that never chose does not fit those categories. It is not guilty by rebellion. It is not righteous by faithfulness. It simply is. Innocent, unfinished, small. A life too brief to become evidence against itself. So the old visions of the afterlife force a question they do not always answer. Where does innocence without biography belong? This is not a question of chambers. It is a question of mercy. That is why we turn to these apocalypses. Not to build another architecture, but to ask whether the ancient imagination had room for a soul outside the usual categories of judgment. Whether there is a text that dares to imagine mercy where accusation has nothing to say. Because that is what matters now, not geography, but whether a soul that never had time to defend itself is left defenseless after death. And the Apocalypse of Peter matters because it answers with an image before it answers with an argument. It does not begin with the scales, it begins with an angel. The Apocalypse of Peter is one of the oldest Christian visions of the afterlife. It was written in the 2nd century. It circulated widely. It shaped how early Christians imagined what happens after death. And in the middle of its severe visions of judgment, it does something unexpectedly tender. It gives children a place, not as an afterthought, not as a footnote to a larger punishment scene, but as a specific image of reception. In Peter's vision, the realms of the dead are divided. The righteous have one place, the wicked have another. But children whose lives ended before they could understand good and evil are not treated as if they belong to the logic of punishment. They are not sent to torment. They are not forgotten. They are delivered to the care of an angel. This is the crucial moment. Peter does not say they are judged and found innocent. He does not say they are given a lesser reward. He does not begin by placing them inside a chamber. He gives us a guardian. That matters, because the image shifts the entire frame, from consequence to care, from judgment to protection, from what a soul has done to the mercy given to a soul that could not yet act for itself. An angel does not appear here as an accuser. The angel appears as the one who receives, the one who holds what is fragile, the one who protects what is unfinished, the one who carries what cannot walk on its own. So Peter's vision does not hand the child first to a court, it hands the child to a guardian. But Peter also leaves us with silence. He does not tell us how long the angel remains. He does not tell us whether this care is only a threshold moment or whether it continues. He does not tell us whether the child remains as it was or whether there is some form of growth under angelic protection. And those gaps matter, because they force the question beneath the image. What does angelic care mean? Is the angel only receiving the soul at the border, or is the angel guarding a life that death interrupted before it could become complete? Is this a moment of transfer, or a state of protection? Peter does not answer all of that, and we should not pretend he does, but he gives us enough to reject one terrible possibility. A soul too young to speak is not pictured as abandoned. A soul too young to choose is not pictured as condemned. A soul too young to defend itself is not left undefended. It is received. And if Peter gives us the angel, the next question becomes unavoidable. Received into what? That is where another ancient text becomes important, not as the center of this episode, not as a replacement for Peter, but as the background that helps us ask where such a guarded soul might belong. There is a distinction the ancient texts seem to feel, even when they do not name it directly. The distinction between a soul that chose wrongly and a soul that never had time to choose at all. Most ancient visions of judgment are built around the first category. Someone who knew enough to be responsible. Someone who saw the crossroads. Someone who walked the wrong way and continued. That soul carries guilt because guilt requires more than existence. It requires intention. It requires understanding. It requires the moment when the self turns and turns knowingly. A child who dies in infancy never reached that moment. Not because innocence answers every theological question. Not because a brief life explains the whole mystery of the soul, but because conscious rebellion requires a will that has been given time to form, and time is exactly what was taken away. This is the distinction that matters. Guilt is not simply the absence of goodness. Guilt is the presence of chosen rebellion. A soul that never rebelled is not the same as a soul declared righteous by a lifetime of faithfulness. But it is also not the same as a soul that stood before the law and refused it. The child's soul occupies a third position, not condemned by conscious rebellion, not justified by works, not placed easily inside the machinery of reward and punishment. It arrives before death without a record long enough to accuse it, simply unfinished. Small. A life interrupted before it could become a moral record. Ancient apocalypses often move by categories. Faithfulness receives reward, rebellion receives punishment. But the soul that arrives before those categories can fully apply is harder to place, and yet Peter places it. Not through an argument, through an image. He does not say the child is righteous by deeds. He does not say the child earned a place among the faithful. He says the child is received. That is the word carrying the weight here. Received. As if the soul's smallness, its inability to form a history of rebellion, its inability to stand before the law as an accountable actor, calls for a different kind of response. Not judgment, care, not a verdict, a guardian. So the question is no longer whether the child deserves punishment. That question begins to dissolve when we understand what guilt requires. The question becomes quieter and more precise. If this soul is not condemned by what it did, and not justified by what it did, where does it belong? Peter gives us an angel, but Enoch gives us a place, and together they begin to form an answer. First, Enoch is not a simple text. It is a collection of visions assembled over centuries, attributed to the man who walked with God and did not die. And in chapter 22, it offers something important for this episode. Not one chamber for all the dead, not one undivided darkness where every soul waits together, but a structured place, divided, ordered, separated according to what each soul carried in life. Enoch is led to a mountain in the west. Inside it, he sees hollow places, chambers carved out of the invisible world, and the angel Raphael explains what he is seeing. These are the places where the spirits of the dead are gathered, set apart, waiting, not yet at their final destination, but held until the day of judgment comes. And one of those chambers is different. It is associated with the righteous. The souls gathered there are not described as being in torment. They are not shown as abandoned. They wait in a condition set apart from punishment. This is not the final resurrection. Enoch does not present it as the end of the story. It is an intermediate state, a place between death and what comes after judgment. But it is not the same as condemnation. And that distinction matters, because Enoch 22 was not written primarily about infants. We should be honest about that. It was written about the dead, the righteous, and the unresolved justice of the world. But the structure it creates is significant, because it tells us that the ancient imagination did not picture all the dead as waiting in the same condition. The beyond is not one undifferentiated silence. It is divided according to what each soul was. And if there is a place associated with the righteous, a place of waiting that is not punishment, then the moral tension returns. Where does a soul fit that never had time to become guilty? Not righteous by works, not condemned by rebellion, not easily placed among those whose lives became a record of refusal. Enoch does not answer that directly, but his structure creates room for the question. A beyond that is divided, a place set apart from punishment, a condition of waiting associated with the righteous. Peter gives us the angel who receives. Enoch gives us a place where the received might belong. Neither text gives us everything, but together they give us a responsible path. Not certainty beyond the texts, not a doctrine built from silence, but a hope shaped by two ancient images, a guardian and a place among the righteous. So the next step is no longer only textual, it becomes personal. If Peter gives us the guardian and Enoch gives us the place, then I have to say carefully what I believe those two images mean together. I want to be careful here, because there is a difference between what the texts say, what the texts suggest, and what I believe. Peter says the child is delivered to the care of an angel. Enoch gives us a place associated with the righteous, separate from condemnation. That is what the texts give us. What comes next is not another quotation, it is a conviction. Mine. And I want to state it openly, so you can weigh it for what it is. I believe children who die before conscious rebellion, before the will has had time to turn against the good, before the self has had time to form a record of refusal, do not belong among the condemned. They are received. They are held. They belong, I believe, with the righteous, not because they earned that place by a lifetime of faithfulness, but because they never had time to forfeit it by rebellion. That distinction matters, because this is not a doctrine of universal innocence. It is not the claim that every soul is saved regardless of what it chooses. It is something more precise. Moral accountability requires moral capacity, and moral capacity requires time. A soul that never had time cannot be held inside the same logic as a soul that did. That is why Peter and Enoch matter together. Peter gives us the angel who receives. Enoch gives us a place associated with the righteous. One gives us care. The other gives us location. And when those two images stand beside each other, they do not give us a complete doctrine. But they do point somewhere. They point away from abandonment, away from condemnation, away from the idea that a soul too young to speak is treated as if it had chosen rebellion. And they point towards something else, care, reception, and a place that is not punishment. That is the heart of my conviction. A child who arrives before corruption, before conscious rebellion, before life could become evidence against itself, is not pictured in these texts as lost in the dark. The child is received. The child is guarded. The child is held with the righteous, not among the condemned. I cannot prove more than the texts allow, and I will not pretend that Peter and Enoch answer every theological question, but I also will not pretend that their images are empty. An angel receiving the child is not an empty image. A place set apart from punishment is not an empty image. Together, they form a hope with shape, not vague comfort, not sentiment built from silence, a hope shaped by ancient Christian imagination. And for someone carrying this question quietly, a parent, a family, anyone who has watched a small life end before it could begin, that matters. Because the most terrible conclusion would be this: that a soul too small to sin is treated as if it had. I do not believe that. Peter gives us a guardian. Enoch gives us a place associated with the righteous, and my conviction, stated carefully, held openly, is that those two images belong together, a soul without a voice, received, guarded, not placed among the condemned, but held among those who wait in the care of heaven. That is what I believe. But if this conviction is going to stand, we need to ask whether another ancient apocalypse gives us a second witness, not only a place, not only a guardian, but angelic presence at the very moment the soul leaves the body. The moment a soul leaves the body is one of the most frightening images in ancient apocalyptic literature, not because death is silent, but because, in these visions, death is crowded. The Apocalypse of Paul, a later Christian apocalypse from the 4th and 5th century world, gives us something Peter and Enoch do not give us directly. Not the guardian after death, not the chamber where souls wait, but the moment of departure itself, the instant when the soul leaves the body. In Paul's vision, that moment is not empty. It is not a solitary crossing. The soul does not simply fall alone into darkness. Angels are present at the threshold. Good angels and hostile powers appear as the soul departs. They witness the crossing. They respond to what the soul has become. And for the righteous, that angelic presence is protective. The soul is not abandoned in the passage. It is accompanied. It is spoken for. It is carried into the invisible order that waits beyond the body. Now, Paul is not writing primarily about infants. We should be honest about that, as we were honest about Enoch. His vision is broader. It is concerned with accountability across a life. It shows reward, punishment, accusation, protection, and consequence. But the structure he gives us matters. Because Paul shows that in this ancient Christian imagination, death is not pictured as a private fall into nothing. It is a crossing with witnesses, a border where unseen powers gather, a moment where the soul is met. And that brings us back to the child. What accompanies a soul that never had time to become guilty? Peter already gave us the answer in one image. An angel receives it. But Paul helps us understand why that image belongs to the world these texts imagine. Angelic presence at death is not strange there. It is not decoration. It is part of how the invisible world responds when a soul leaves the body. The righteous are not left alone at the threshold. They are met, they are accompanied, they are witnessed. And if Peter's angel receives the child who never had a voice, Paul's vision makes that reception feel less isolated. The child does not disappear into silence. The child is met at the border. The child is carried through the moment it could never understand. Peter gives us the guardian. Enoch gives us the place. Paul gives us presence at the moment of departure, not proof beyond all question, not a doctrine completed by 3 apocalypses, but 3 images that lean in the same direction. A soul too young to answer is not imagined as alone. 3 texts, 3 images, and a boundary we cannot cross carelessly. Peter gives us a guardian. Enoch gives us a place. Paul gives us presence at the moment of departure. Together they give us something real. But they do not give us everything. That matters. Because images can carry hope without answering every question. They can illuminate one part of the darkness and still leave another part in shadow. Peter gives us reception, a child delivered to the care of an angel. But he does not tell us how long the guardian remains. He does not tell us what the child becomes. He gives us the first mercy, not the whole future. Enoch gives us structure, a place associated with the righteous, a condition of waiting that is not punishment. But he does not directly say where a soul without moral history belongs. He gives us a divided beyond, not a full answer to the child. Paul gives us the threshold. Angels present as the soul leaves the body, a crossing that is not solitary. But he does not tell us what comes next for the one who never had time to answer. He gives us witness, not final destination. So what do we actually have? A guardian, a place, a presence, reception, waiting, witness. Not a complete doctrine, not certainty beyond what the texts can carry. Not a final answer to every theological question these small lives raise. And we need to say that clearly. Because the worst thing we could do is force these texts to speak more loudly than they actually speak, to offer certainty where the texts offer direction. That would not be reverence, That would not be honesty. But careful reading does not mean the images point nowhere. Peter, Enoch, and Paul do not arrive at the same destination with equal force, but they lean in the same direction. Not abandonment, not condemnation, not silence, care, reception. A guarded crossing, a place associated with the righteous, not with punishment. That is what the texts give us, not enough to erase every mystery, but enough to refuse the cruelest possibility that a soul too young to answer is left unanswered by heaven. So now the question is no longer only textual, it becomes personal. After the guardian, the place, and the threshold, I have to say the sentence this entire video has been moving toward. I have watched people carry this question for years, not as a theological puzzle, as a wound. A parent who never brought a child home from the hospital, a family that counted weeks instead of years, a grief with no ceremony large enough to hold it. And underneath all of it, the question almost too painful to ask directly, where did that soul go? Not as a request for a map, not as a demand for a doctrine, but as the rawest form of the question faith can face. Is that child somewhere? Is that child held? Is that child lost? I have read Peter, I have read Enoch, I have read Paul, and I have tried not to force them to say more than they say. But I also cannot pretend they say nothing. Peter refuses abandonment. Enoch refuses one undivided darkness. Paul refuses the solitary crossing. And when those refusals stand together, they make one image impossible for me to hold. A soul too small to sin being treated as if it had. That is the image I cannot accept. The texts do not give me that picture. They give me another one. An angel who receives. A place that is not punishment. A crossing that is not solitary. And from those three witnesses, I draw the sentence this video has been moving toward. I cannot see these children as lost, not because every